Very cool. I'm going to also probably turn off my webcam here just to, there we go, just so that we can all focus on what's going on here on the screen. Welcome everybody. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and can everybody see that okay? Is that all right?
Yep, we can see it just fine.
Very good. And at the very top, like Ray said, there's slides.app.goo.gul and a little couple letters there. If you type that in, you will be able to ask questions and raise your hand and do things like that. And that way I'll be able to see those kinds of things while I'm presenting, because there are a couple different sections to our talk. But I'll start off with me. My name is Benji. I'm a front-end developer at Top Hat. Top Hat is a local marketing firm in Pittsburgh. You might have heard of our founder, Ben Butler. He spoke a couple months ago about hosting $1 million grossing WordPress sites. And at work, I make a lot of WordPress sites with the help of some pretty amazing designers. We make some cool sites. So I wanted to give Top Hat a special shout out, because we'll be seeing some things that we did for some R&D for work projects. And they gave me permission to use that in the talk tonight. And so I'm pretty excited about that. So also, important thing to note, I have a really cute kid, but he might be audible in the background occasionally. We've asked him to stay down the hall, and he's watching a movie right now, but just in case. But okay, so let's get into things. Tonight we're going to talk about WordPress and headless WordPress, which is a strange part of WordPress, because 90% of what I'm going to say tonight is not PHP. It's not really WordPress. It's about front-end JavaScript and some front-end frameworks, specifically Vue and a static site generator for Vue that's called Nuxt, and I'll explain that in a little bit. If you'll bear with me, I'll explain why we wanted to use Nuxt for this talk and a few other things about that. So the first thing, the most critical thing, is that we are in 2020, and in 2020, we need some modern speeds with the familiar tools that we use every day. If you don't know all the tools that I'm going to mention, that's fine. There are tons of ways to use WordPress, and so it's totally okay if you're using this with different tools. And probably what's going to happen is you're going to see similar things anyway. And then when we talk about modern speeds, what I'm going to talk about is primarily things that have to do with bounce rate. So you can see this bounce rate is this blue line here. And bounce rate is when a user comes to your website one time, looks at one single page, and then leaves forever, and you never see them again. So you can see that bounce rate grows quite rapidly depending on the speed of your page load. And when you get to about maybe 3.2 seconds, you've lost 20%, maybe about 3.8 seconds, you've lost 30% of the users that have come to see your site. And you've spent a lot of work on that. And your clients would be very angry if you told them that 30% of their users are just leaving after one page view. So you want to speed that up. And so here's a tool that I used. I used Google's Lighthouse to see what's going on. And we can see that if we speed things up, we can get a speed index down to maybe 1.1 seconds for a site that we were working on. You can get a very quick speed index, and that means that you don't have to worry so much about that bounce rate based on your page load times. And then we've got some familiar tools, and this is where we'll get back into WordPress and the things that make WordPress easy and convenient, and the reasons that your clients want WordPress. You've got custom post types and advanced custom fields. You can also use things like Webpack and linters. You can use these in your regular WordPress build, and if you are familiar with those terms and you know what they are, they will make you feel at home, and you want to keep those tools around, so you want something that's able to use them. You'll also want to use some things that are JavaScript libraries, maybe things that make really convenient carousels like Slick Slider. You'll want to use maybe some other ones, and we'll talk about how to integrate any JavaScript libraries that you were pulling from a CDN or with a script tag. And then also maybe some plugins like Yoast and WP Contact Form 7. They're pretty common things, and also advanced custom fields, things that, again, make you feel comfortable, make your clients feel comfortable, and generally make things safe and convenient. So we want those familiar tools, but we want to go fast. And WordPress is okay, but WordPress is on a server. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why I chose Nuxt to be some of our content, some of our front-end framework, and why we're using Vue as our front-end framework. And I think the main thing is when you're looking at front-end frameworks, you have to start somewhere. And when it comes to the three big names, which is React and Angular and Nuxt, React, Angular, and Vue. Vue might be, it's hard to say the easiest to start with, but Vue certainly has a very simple setup and a very convenient way to see things. And so Vue is a pretty good place to start. And Nuxt is kind of like a building block on top of Vue that actually makes it a lot simpler. And in my case, it made things possible where I didn't have to really think about routing pages and doing anything complex with the Vue that I was using. Another reason that I used Nuxt and Vue is because Sarah Drasner and a couple other people have made really convenient articles. There was one in Smashing Magazine just a few months ago that was about headless WordPress and using headless WordPress on the Jamstack. So that's pretty cool. And so maybe one of the questions you're asking right now is, what is all this talk about front-end frameworks and all that? And basically what it does is you'll have your database where you're hosting your site, and your database is using WordPress. And so any sort of content and things you're going to be managing is going to be on here. But then when you're talking about what the users that come to your site are going to see, they're going to be seeing something that's built with this, which is Nuxt. And so there are some interesting things that happen here. Number one, Nuxt builds some of your things beforehand. And it can also take the content that you've generated and it can build it, and it can live on another sort of server. And this place, all your content can live, but it will be ready immediately to go to the users. So instead of having to build your pages every time something loads, or every time you go to a new page to have to go through WP query or some other process to gather information from the database, Nuxt will take all of that and do all of that once, and then it will store it, and then the user can just grab it immediately. So that's one of the ways that front-end frameworks have become very fast. Another cool thing about that is, let's say you become instantly successful and your hosting provider has some sort of system where the amount of database calls and the amount of use that you have, that you pay based on that. Well, if you've got this on something like Netlify, then your users will be going to Netlify and grabbing that thing, and that thing will be very small. It'll be just the markup of the page and any JavaScript that goes with it. And they won't be calling the database over and over again. So if you experience a big boom in popularity, then you'll be able to see that this is actually saving you a lot of money. It's a lot faster for your users, and maybe in turn you'll get even more popularity and users from it. So that's another good reason to use a front-end framework. And like I said, we'll be using Nuxt tonight. Okay, so to get started, we have to figure out how we're going to take the information from WordPress and use it in our front-end framework. And WordPress makes this very easy, since I think WordPress version 5.2 or something like that, they've had this REST API. It's really standardized, and it uses JSON to deliver just text strings of all the data that you need. So if you've got a page, you can query the REST API for that page, and you could pull most of the data from it. And most WordPress sites have this, and it's visible. So you could go to some pretty famous WordPress sites, and you'll be able to see this REST API. But we're going to look into a couple of the endpoints, which are URLs that access the REST API, and give specific examples that will help you get started, and also maybe just for me to complain about some things. So cool. So yeah, so here we have your domain, and then /wp JSON/v2. And pretty much if you type this into any WordPress site that you have, you'll see something come up. It'll probably be just a jumble of text on your computer. If you have something fancy like I do here, when I'm using Firefox, it will show me kind of this special table outlook of all the data. It'll be really convenient, but it could just be some text. But that text will be the data that's coming from your site without a lot of the visual elements. So this works by default for a lot of things. Most of your posts and pages will have one of these. And also the plugins that we're talking about will also probably have most of the, well, I can verify with the plugins that I've used that they have endpoints as well. So the main one there for the posts and pages will just be posts. So WP JSON/v2/posts, question mark. This will be for your parameters here. So page, you'll be on the first page, and per page, about I think 100 is the maximum, maybe 250 is the maximum. I can't remember off the top of my head. But what this is saying is that every post up to post 100 will come through here. Now, I have not done this to the level where I'm paginating this, but there's a good number of posts that you can get on just the first page. And so this has been acceptable for the scaling that we've been using it at. The same thing for the pages. You'll get the first 100 pages of your site from just this endpoint that goes WP JSON v2 pages, and then those pages. So like I said, also, these two also have endpoints. And the interesting thing about Yoast is that Yoast is going to be in all of these pages as well. So I didn't even bother working on the Yoast endpoint. I just used these pages, and I pulled the key named Yoast head from that, and it gave me all the stuff. We'll talk about that a little bit later. WP contact form 7, it has WP JSON v2 contact form 7. So that's very convenient. And you've got contact forms, and then every form that you have has a form ID. And so you'll just use this, and this will be the post URL that you can post your forms from your new site. So that, or from your headless version of your site. So that's how that's going to go. Custom posts, unfortunately, ACFs and custom fields, they're going to be a little more complicated, but custom posts are pretty simple. Custom posts, you can just use this when you're setting up your custom post type. So there's that huge array that has all of the different things about, is this public? Is this going to have a slug? Like what's the name for this custom post type? Inside of there, there's also show in REST. And if you set that to true, then it'll show in the REST API, which is very convenient. Okay, so ACFs, this was the first step that I got to that I said, whoa, okay, maybe this is not so simple. Because if I read a blog like that beautiful smashing, the smashing blog that I was talking about earlier, smashingmagazine.com, they seem to make it look so easy, but they don't talk about all these little details. And so ACFs, they actually take a bit more work. And so somewhere in your site, you're going to have to expose these ACFs to the REST API. And that starts with this register REST field. That's the real big thing that you're going to do here. And then you'll expose the ACF fields, which is just running this get fields. This might be pretty standard for you if you build page templates. You take get fields and you just return that as a callback inside of this method. I'm going to make these slides available at the end, but also I wanted to show you kind of what this is doing and what we're talking about here. So this will take all of the fields inside of each post type that you set, and it will put them in the REST API. You can even, let's see if I can find where here. Here it is. You can even specify the key where these fields will live. So they'll live right there in the ACF key. And then you have to add the action to make this happen. But if you put this in functions.php, then you'll get all those fields for every custom post type or regular post type that you have, and it will output there. So that's some brief introductory talking about the WordPress API, the REST API, which is really cool. But then also WordPress itself takes some time to load, and some things happen with WordPress that it's not instant. So if we're looking to make a really instant site, a headless site, then maybe if we're querying a lot to WordPress, we need to lower the amount of things that it's doing on every single time that something's loaded. And so there is this beautiful little thing called short init that you can define, and this is in WP config, so this is a pretty deep configuration setting. But it will take the response time for your pages to 29 milliseconds or so. I put an asterisk there because that's what Delicious Brains says, and I trust them. They're a pretty reliable company, pretty good blog. But when I tried to do this with WP Engine, who was our hosting provider, there was, I couldn't see any change in the speed. So this is something that you can do. It could be very helpful, especially if you're querying often to your WordPress site from your headless site. In our case, we were not doing that because we were doing a marketing site, and we only needed to build it once. And like I said, it's not going to query the database over and over again if you do it that way. So we made a static site. We didn't need to do that. Okay, so this is a good pausing point. I know it's a lot of content already. And so if you have any questions, I'll start by looking at the questions that are in audience tools, but also you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask any questions that way about the REST API. So we have one question here from Jeff. It says, does this work automatically for all ACF field types like repeaters? And the answer is yes. The same way, like if you use get fields on your page template, this is going to output the same information. So I usually use get fields because it allows me to pull all of the data for that page at the top of the page and use all of that in my PHP. And I can use something like a for loop instead of additional queries to my database over and over again. I'll just pull that one time with get fields. It's super fast and convenient, and it gives me sort of just a single array that I can work with really easily. In this case, it's just going to make that array and it's going to put it into JSON. And so you'll be able to use it on the front end in the same way that you would be using it on a page type. So that was about ACFs. Does anybody else have any questions? Are we good to continue?
I think we're good to continue.
Very good. Okay. All right. So now we'll talk a little bit about Nuxt and how to set that up. Now, Nuxt is based sort of on the NPM structure. And so you use yarn or NPM to get it going. And so you've got to have NPM, Node, Vue, and Nuxt, and just install them all. There's very easy guides online. I'm not going to go through that today. And also you'll probably want a repo to store your files that you're building, and then you can configure any deployment webhooks on the site that you're going to, or on the server that you're going to store, hosting provider that you're going to store this information on, like Netlify. And yeah, that's pretty straightforward. It's super secret, awesome step there. There is something that's really cool for dev tools that makes Vue very easy to use. You can see all of the data that you have in the Shadow DOM. You can view it in different ways. And so I really recommend that if you're using Vue, that you use these tools in your browser, and they come for Firefox and Chrome, and I'm sure many other browsers as well. So that'll make it easier for you to debug your site and view it in very simple ways. Okay, and this is where it gets a little more complicated. So when you're starting up the app that you're going to make, and this again, this is the static front end version of your site. Then you'll start with npx create Nuxt app, and then your app's name. And then it'll have a whole ton of questions here. You don't have to worry too much about these questions, except we're going to need Axios. And so when it has Nuxt.js modules, we'll make sure to choose that. And then your deployment target will be static, so that you can host this on Jamstack. Interesting side note, Jamstack these days, they're saying that it's a very common term, so you can just capitalize the J and leave the rest. So if anybody wants a really easy pull request, you can do that on Nuxt. I'm sure that you could get a nice little boost to your GitHub profile. You're a contributor to Nuxt. So that's very good. And then this loads, then you have all of these git commands. This will add your files and commit them to your repo, and let's see, add your origin here. For, in this case, I used GitHub, and push all of your files to the origin. At this point, you'll have all of the files that you just created, and they'll be on GitHub as well. And then npm run dev, that's what will be able to start your server locally, and you can view this site and be developing on that. And it will, they say, I think Sarah Drasner says it's a lukewarm reload. It's supposed to be something that will reload all the time, but sometimes you do have to restart it. But it should be, even when you're changing configuration files, it should be good to go. Okay, so then we want to go back to REST. We want to go to the endpoints that we have, grab the data from there, hopefully only once, and then we want to take it and put it in our new site and our new, our front end version of the site. And so we can do this with a cool Vue thing called the Vuex store. And the vue-slick store is at the base directory of your site. And maybe at question times, I can pull up my my VS Code, and you can see the directory structure of Vue, just in case you get lost. But it's basically just the very base directory. There's a store folder, and inside of that you can have index.js. And if it's not there, you can make it. Inside of there, it has this Vuex store. The strange thing about Vue is that everything is stored in state. So you can see up here, state. Everything is stored in here. And if you know JavaScript, it's pretty simple. You see we're just creating some JavaScript objects there that are like PHP arrays. But state, you can't modify the state directly. You can only modify the state with mutations. So that's why there's this section here called mutations. And mutations use actions to modify the state. And so that's the big complicated glob of stuff here. And we're gonna go through that now. So we've got those things. Oh, I like that. Now that I figured out the pointer, we don't have to use that kind of stuff. Okay, so here is here's a Vue store action, Vuex store action, where we're going to go to our domain, to the REST API endpoint for our custom post type, and we're going to pull 100, up to 100, as many as there are, up to 100 of the pages for that site. And the pages in this case are going to be every single one of those custom, very sorry. This is the number of pages one, the custom post types that you have. So up to 100 of the custom post types and any pages that are associated with them will come over from this URL. So we're using, in this case, fetch, and fetch is one of the tools in JavaScript for doing sort of Ajax-like calls. And if you want to know more about that, you can talk to me later. I've written a couple blogs about different ways that you can do this in JavaScript. But we've got fetch, and we have this thing called async. So async means that you can wait for this command to finish before continuing on with more logic. And that's what you want, because this is an internet request. This is a REST request. It's a GET request to your site. And it's going to take a little time for that data to come back. So if your JavaScript just kept running, that wouldn't be any good. So you can use this async term here and await here. And that means that WP projects will fill up when you finish, when this command is finished. And then you can turn that response into your JSON. You can store it as JSON here. And you can do some things with it. So one thing you can do is filter all of the custom post types that come in and make sure that you only have published posts. So that seems like a smart thing to do. We don't want to show anything that's not published on our front end version of our site. Another thing you can do is that, as you saw before, even just that screenshot that I had, there is just so much information. And so one thing you can do to make it a little simpler on yourself is to map some of the information that's in the array and pull out that information, but just let the rest go. You don't need to store it on your front end. You're not doing anything with it. So only take the things that you need. So in this case, I'm taking the ACFs, the title of the page, the slug of that page or the custom post type, and also Yoast head, as we talked about before. And those are the only things that I want from my custom post types. Pretty much everything that I use custom post types for is going to be an ACF anyway, so it's easier for the client to use. So if I'm pulling that, that's 90% of what I have. Then we have this commit. Commit is what we're going to do. So this is going to take it back to your mutation, and this is going to commit through that mutation and update the state on your page. And then if for some reason this request fails or has some sort of error, we want to catch that error. And that's how we can do that. We can put that here. So we can let this happen. We can try, and we can let this try to happen. But if something goes wrong, we can maybe console log it or do something with that error. It's very unlikely to happen after you have already debugged it and after this is set up properly. So at that point, I would probably not need that. And then at the very, very top here, we have this part that says if state.wp-projects.length return. That means that if you already have WP projects in your state, you don't need to get it again. It hasn't changed since the last time you did this. So if you've done this and it's already there, just return. We don't need to query the database again, or we don't need to do anything more. We've already got the things that we were looking for. Okay, so that is one part of the Vuex store. And we want to store this in our static site, and that's a little bit different. And so one thing that we need to add for that is a sort of plugin that we've created here. And this is going to be in services.server.js. That's inside of this static. I'm pretty sure that's inside of, let me just look at it really quick here. That's inside of the static folder in the base directory. And services.server.js is going to kind of help to store these things in your base static site build. So when you deploy it to Netlify, it will do this and it will save that information there. You also need to open your nuxt.config.js. And this is going to be a very general and useful file for you that you become familiar with. And inside of there is a plugins line. And inside of the plugins key, you can add this plugins that you make, which is super simple. Just basically does that. It dispatches those things and then puts them into the store. And you just add the reference for that as a value in this plugins key. And so then when you go to your page, and you're going to have a lot of Vue templates, which are .vue on your page, you will import the map state, which is the state that I'm talking about, the Vuex store state. You'll import that from Vuex. And then you can take that and you can even filter it more or do something more to it and use that on your page in various ways. All right. Before we go to questions, I do want to explain one more thing about Vue, because now we have all of this information on our page, but how do we use it? And I'm going to think that most of the time, this is going to look really familiar, because when I'm working in PHP, I'm not doing things that are very different. When I have some information that I want, let's say a source for an image, then I'm going to plug that in and I'm going to sort of echo that source here. There are a couple things that we do want to note, though. There are a couple differences in Vue from PHP. If there is a giant string of HTML, we'll have to use something special, and that's called v-html. Anytime you're using JavaScript inside of the HTML on a Vue template, you'll have these little colons here. And the colons will say that this is not the literal text that I want you to work with. What I want you to do is use JavaScript to return what I want here. And so in this case, go through this JavaScript object and get the URL for the logo. And that's going to be what the source for this image is. The same thing, I want the alt text, so grab that too. If I have a big string of text, then I can put it in these mustache, we call them mustache braces, and you can output it that way. And there's really a ton more, so I've also put a link here that you can use. There are different things. I've got a plugin here for lazy loading, and so I lazy load this background, and that's why it's called lazy background. But this is all, again, just grabbing from an ACF. You can do for loops. You can do, like I said, HTML, just outputting HTML. There are so many ways that you can use this, and so it's pretty super convenient. And it looks, now I use a lot of JavaScript. I would say it looks a little bit easier to me than some of the PHP echoes that I've had to work with. And going back and forth is a little bit simpler with this one, I think. And then there we have it. And so you can see we've got a page, and it's outputting every single one of these custom post types. And here I used a v-for, which is the same as a for loop in PHP. And I'll put everything that I need there. So a little icon and also some text. And also that was a link that took it to another page. So that's a little bit about how Vue and Nuxt are working to get us the information that we need all the way from that REST API. And I've gone pretty fast through that. So if there are any questions, now's a great time. If you feel like, well, maybe I've not mentioned something that's necessary or something like that, now's also a great time. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help.
Hey Benji, I got a question for you.
Sure.
So since what I'm understanding is you're using Nuxt to output what is essentially the front end of the WordPress website, and the data is just coming from the WordPress database in one way or another. So does that mean that we're not writing themes for WordPress is irrelevant because you're totally bypassing that step?
You don't really have to. You can do it here. You can also use any sort of styles. You can localize the styles inside of Vue components. And if you componentize some of this, it'll even separate that out and make it faster. So you're not saving all of the all of the CSS, oh goodness gracious, all of the CSS in one giant file. You can actually just give the stuff that you need for this individual template or this individual component. And yeah, otherwise it does, you will be creating your front end through this. And so the styles and things would have to be brought along in another way. In this case, at the beginning, I just grabbed the CSS file and put it at the head of the document. And so the same CSS that was on our WordPress instance was here, but we did have to go through the HTML and add this as Vue components and Vue templates. It wasn't that hard because I was just copying basically, here's a for loop, here's a v-for, here's an echo of some stuff from the get fields, and here is an echo from some stuff from a JavaScript object. So it felt really similar, I guess.
Gotcha. And as a follow-up question, this means that when you go into the WordPress admin and you go to edit your pages or whatever custom post types you have, like that's totally irrelevant now because all of the Vue stuff is being done with Nuxt.
See, I disagree a little bit there now, and I don't know if this is just because of the scale that we're building our sites, but most of the time, because we have designers designing all of that, we're templating out everything very, very specifically, pixel perfect, exactly what the designers want. And since we do that, we control a lot of that. And what our end users will be doing is entering in ACFs, choosing, for example, what kind of content blocks they want to go in certain parts of the page. That's all stuff that can be translated into this. So those kinds of options, we build those into ACFs and some other areas instead of allowing the user full carte blanche control over the templates.
Okay, gotcha. But like if the user wanted to create a new page, they would have to enter all of the page data into advanced custom fields.
Yes.
Right.
They're usually going to be content creating, and they'll be creating any sort of the content that goes on that page. Mm-hmm. But generally what we're doing is creating those page templates for them. So even a general page template would be something that we would do for the client.
Gotcha. Thanks.
No worries. Any other questions? Okay. All right. I'll keep moving, and you can always ask them on audience tools. Okay. Moving on, we're going to get to some JS libraries, and this is actually 10 times easier, in my opinion, for a JavaScript framework. It's all built in. And so using NPM, you can install a lot of different things like Slick Slider and even jQuery without having to do anything on that final page or on that page template. You can just do it here in the terminal, and it will set it up in a very convenient and very easy way. And this is where you'll also start using Vue plugins. So in this case, vue-slick is kind of a port of Slick Slider. All the same options. It looks very similar. I'll show it to you in a minute, but it's using a ported version for Vue so that it's more convenient and actually a little tiny bit, I want to say it's a little bit better. I don't remember if it's this plugin or not, but sometimes these plugins, because they're more recent, they will actually be better for your SEO page score or your site speed. because they'll be smaller. So that's just npm install and save dev. That means that it'll go in your development environment that you're loading, and then the plugin name. So that can be a shortcut, npm i-D, and then your name. You can even string them together like that. And then on your Vue components and Vue templates, you can import. In this case, we're importing the $, so that every time we use the $, we're using jQuery's $. So we can mount that on our page, and inside of mounted, we can use jQuery, just like we would anywhere else. Slick slider for static sites, it got a little bit more complicated. As you can see, this is how we're building the slick slider, and I've been talking about v4 a lot, and so v4 counter, v4 the rate, and then counter is just the counter, just the number index for that in homepage.acf.testimonials. So within this PHP array or JavaScript object, you will get each rating and the counter for it, and you'll output it here. This is exactly what I would do in PHP. I do have a key for each item, and that helps Vue to sort out what's going on for each single part of this iteration. But the rest of it, it looks exactly like PHP to me. And then inside of the script, instead of having to go through the jQuery version of this, we can simply, let's see here. Here we are. All the settings just go in slick options here. So we'll import the map state because we're doing that on the page. And we will have all of our slick options in the data section of our JavaScript there. And then there is this section for mounted. There's a reason for that. There was a problem with static site, with using static site generation with Nuxt. And so even though vue-slick works great, it usually wants to server-side render that. And in this case, we needed to find this, we needed to follow the steps in this Stack Overflow to figure out how to get Vue to work at the right stage, to start loading at the right stage. So we actually had to go back and create a little bit of a plugin, and notice that we did not import vue-slick. Usually we would import it up here. But in this case, we had a component that we loaded here, and that allowed it to happen after the window, after the DOM had been sort of created. And that gets a little bit more technical than I want to, but there are ways to get around this, and so I've included that here. But in the end of the day, you can have your slick slider, the same kind of slick slider that you have, and all of the options here. And again, it'll be static and super fast. Okay, so now questions about, we're starting to get into using Vue in a deeper way. And so any questions about that? Here's one from Mer. Does this work well with AWS Lightsail instances? That's a good question. I'm not familiar with AWS Lightsail. I've used other parts of AWS, but not that one. If Lightsail is AWS's sort of Netlify competitor, then I would say that probably it does. I know that AWS has something like that Google has something like that there are a lot of things like Netlify out there that will basically store this static representation of your site. Technically, you could even use GitHub Pages for some of this, because if you have that static site built, you can just upload it to GitHub and incorporate I believe it's the C name for your site for GitHub, and then you've got it there. But I'm not familiar with AWS Lightsail, so I don't know if anybody else can answer that question. That's fine. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, now let's move on to getting our site SEO friendly. And I know that we, at work, we use Yoast for this. And I know that there are other tools out there, but Yoast is a pretty popular one. The strange thing about Yoast is this is what Yoast outputs in the REST API. It's got just an absolute string of HTML, straight up HTML. And if I'm on the page template part of Vue, that could be really easy, but that's a lot. It's really a lot to put in the head of your document. And so normally with Nuxt, you would be setting up any SEO elements inside of the head of your JavaScript. And so inside of that script where we've seen things like mount and component and various other things that you're using in JavaScript, there's also head. And inside of the head function, you can return any parts that you want to put in the title, or in the, in the head of your document. And so in this case, I want to have a title attribute where I have the title there. Oh goodness, there we go. And that works really well. But if I want to put all of that Yoast here, it just doesn't look very pretty. So what I did was, before the page fully loads, just as soon as the document is ready to work, I took the mounted part where I've got my jQuery, and I just did this in jQuery. So I have that Yoast head, and that's part of my data that I'm storing inside of the Vuex store. And I find the head, and I append all of that in the head. Except when I do that, the canonical link that Yoast is generating is for my headless site here, which is great, but that's not what I want. So I have to change that. So every time I see that, I want to change the href to be my current URL. And so I used this to take out just the base part of my current URL and let that be the canonical part of the page, or the canonical reference for that page. I should be specific there. Otherwise, Yoast was pretty painless. But do you have any questions about Yoast or using plugins like that for changing the SEO in the head of your page? Okay, good. We'll keep going. So we'll move on to another plugin, WP Contact Form 7. I'll show you the steps that we took to integrate this on the page. It's not as simple as using do shortcode, but it gives you more flexibility and it allows you to do more on that. So forms on any HTML page, forms are the same. You're going to have the form structure in HTML. You're going to add a JS function for your form because you don't want your full page to reset and reload just when somebody submits. So you'll add a JS function for that. And then in that JavaScript function, you're going to use Ajax or something like Ajax to post the information that you get from the form to the form's endpoint. And even on a regular site, that's what we do. We have an action on the HTML, but we also probably use JavaScript and prevent the default action and use Ajax just so the page doesn't reload. And then any responses will help us to see maybe, for example, if your form is valid, if your form was successfully sent, those kinds of things. And we want to parse those resulting responses and store them as well. So here we go. This is how we did it in Nuxt. We had the endpoint that I showed you all the way at the beginning, the REST endpoint. And the first thing we needed to do is get the information from the page. So here we have our template and our form, and it had so many different like text areas and inputs, but here's one of them. And you can see this looks pretty similar. The only things that could be kind of interesting, here's an @submit. That's going to take you to form submit. So in your methods in your script, you can set a method to run here for your @submit. You have, let's see, vModel, which is fun. That means that you can set data, and the model here means any data that's here can be stored here as data in JavaScript. And the rest of that looks pretty much like HTML. So that's good. Now, WP Contact Form 7 likes JavaScript form data. You have to use JavaScript form data. So a lot of different solutions, maybe you'll just use JSON for this. It could be very easy to set those up. But in this case, we actually have to create a form data object and add the data to the form data object with the key and then the data like this. And once you have that data, you can append it to the form data. Okay, from there, we want to post that back to our original site. And so we've got the URL here. And in this case, I'm using Axios, just because I'm mixing it up a little bit. And I'll take the URL with that full endpoint. In this case, I'm going to form 104 on my page, on my WordPress site. Sorry about that. And the method is post. We're using post to send the form data that we've made to this URL. And the headers on this, we're going to set the headers for this request to multi-part form data because we're using form data. Then we have, if it's successful, a response. You can use this for the message, and you can put that in maybe a div in your HTML that can show that message, like you successfully submitted this form, thanks so much, or there was an error in your form or it was invalid. You can show those responses here. Or if there was an error using this, if there was an error with your internet, or if there was an error in another way, that will be caught here. And you can do various debugging things here if you need to make sure that that's a very rare occurrence. Or even maybe you'll show something on the site that says, I'm sorry, this time there was some glitch in the internet. Try it again and it'll work. So this is the action that we have on the form. And oh, I forgot to say very quickly, it's a simple thing, very easy to miss. For the event on this action, we want to prevent all default things from happening. We don't want the page to reload itself. So in this case, I used prevent default on this event for this form to stop the page from reloading. That's a natural thing that happens. Okay, more questions. All right, here's a really good one from Robert. How do you handle spam with WPCF7 in Vue? You can do it a few different ways. First off, any sort of Google reCAPTCHAs and things like that will work in Vue and in Nuxt. You can also use the built-in features of WPCF7 to do that. Or if there are any additional plugins that screen for spam email addresses and things like that, they will all work because they'll be all working on your WordPress site. And your WordPress site will still be processing all of this. If you'll remember back here, you're actually sending this to your WordPress site. So this form will be sent to your WordPress site. WPCF7 will process that, and then it'll give you a response. So anything that's happening there, if you've got additional plugins, it should be fine. It should be good to go. Does anybody have additional questions about using forms on a page? Okay. Next up, this is kind of just a conclusion. We're going pretty well on time. That's good. I did all of this with the expectation that things would be a lot faster. And they were. I improved my score. I think I improved the score for this site maybe about 10 points or something like that on the Lighthouse score, but it just didn't feel like it was enough. I wanted to see the very fastest, the very best thing that was there. And so this is kind of our addendum of things that we did that would help us out even more, and maybe some common tips for how to make your site a little bit faster. The number one thing is the assets on your site, the images, the videos, the things that get downloaded every time your site loads. And my big secret for this is using ImageMagick. ImageMagick is just a command line tool where you can just type in convert and then the file's name and then the output file name. And let's say you have a JPEG, you can turn a JPEG into a WebP, and it will also optimize that file, make it smaller. And so using this and or potentially other things like tiny JPEG or tiny PNG, sorry, JPEG Mini Pro I think is the one that's like for JPEGs. And another one would be tiny PNG, which is I think it's tinypng.org. There are good ways to optimize your images and make them web friendly. The smaller the images, the less that the page has to process before it's finished. Another thing that you can do, and this we found to be very helpful, WPE, which is the hosting provider that we are using for this site, WP Engine is pretty fast. But when I queried images from the original site that were stored on WPE's servers, they took a long time to load. And so I used WP Offload Media Lite, which is a plugin, to take those images and store them on AWS. And as soon as I put them in an S3 bucket on AWS, that was like a major shift on how fast things were working. And that was still, I mean, it's just the files that you have, just the assets that you will be storing somewhere. You'll be hosting them somewhere, but AWS has a really convenient CDN that's very close. And so those files came a lot faster. Another section, maybe it has something to do with the amount of JavaScript you're using on the page. And I would say that JavaScript is kind of another one of those things like plugins. You only want to use as many as you can. You want to use as few as you can. And so any JavaScript that you're loading could potentially make your site slower. And so even if you remove jQuery and you just go back to vanilla JavaScript, the greatest plain flavor there was, it could speed up your site because jQuery itself is a moderately sized library. But there are other libraries that we found that we were using. For example, we used Scroll Magic, and I rewrote what we were using in Scroll Magic to 12 lines of vanilla JavaScript and took out three different CDN-based JS libraries that required to load in a certain order and required that they be loaded before they were, it was very complicated. And so as soon as I took those out, the site speeds up a little bit more. And then as I spoke earlier about CSS files, if you use Vue the way that Vue was built and you use components, then actually all of your CSS could be separated out and chunked into, I think they call it code splitting. It'll split up all of the code into what's needed. So any external parts, any things that aren't being loaded for the part that you're seeing on that page, you don't need to load them for that page. You can prefetch them and load them for other pages, but not, you don't need to do that before the page is loaded. So using Vue components makes your site faster. Also, speaking of preloading and prefetching things, if you preload things that are outside of your control, for example, Typekit, if you're using Typekit fonts, you can add a preloading link for those fonts, and that will speed up your site a little bit because those additional things, they get loaded asynchronously, which means your site doesn't wait for one thing to stop downloading before it starts loading the next one, which is the standard thing that the head of your document will do. So if you add a preloading tag for those things, which there are plenty of tutorials online for how to do that, that will make your site a little bit faster. And the last one, maybe it's just down to your internet, which is unfortunate. I'm using my home internet right now, and I hope that everyone can hear me just fine. It's pretty good at streaming video and doing those things, but maybe there are some hiccups. Maybe there's a lot of bandwidth that's being pulled out of my apartment or my section of town. And so even though it's working pretty well, maybe it's not the fastest that it really could be. And so that's one thing. But also even the plugins on your browser like to load and scan your page and make sure that it's what they're looking for, you know, like an ad blocker or something like that. So test in incognito mode, take off as many plugins as you can from your browser. That will possibly show you a better and more accurate score. And then the last thing is that my parents were very, very kind people. And they said to me, when you go to university, there will be some people that want to get an A, 100% on every single test. And it's going to be really taxing. They're going to spend a lot of time and energy doing that. And it doesn't really matter. And 96%, 100%, they're still an A. They still mean the same thing on your GPA. And that's going to mean the same thing to companies that are looking at you after you graduate. So just remember that a very fast site does not need to be a perfect site. Okay, so we just talked for a really, well, I talked for a really long time and about how we can speed up our WordPress sites, how we can make them more convenient and easier to load for your users. We also talked about how you don't have to store everything and host everything on the thing that you pay for. So you don't have to get the fastest possible thing just to use WP admin. We also talked about modifying your site to make the speed index the fastest it can be and hiding, here's another one that's a good thing to mention, although we didn't have a lot of time to cover, which is when you do this, when you navigate to your page URL /WP admin, nothing happens. It's not there. Your site is hosted in 2 places. And so any references to things that hackers might want to get at are just one more level of abstraction away from them. Also, another thing that we did talk about was that you're using the best practices that you can for JavaScript. And the benefit of that is that people have been using these updated frameworks for JavaScript for the past 5 or 10 years. And so they're very, very convenient. The linters are super easy to use. I hit, I think, Option-Shift-F, and my whole page aligns itself in a way that's very easy to read. There are some really cool things that don't happen if I'm using a PHP file. And also we've got version control, and your client has the fastest site they can, but they don't lose the parts that make it homey. They don't lose that WordPress CMS. And so I hope that this has helped a lot to make your sites better and faster. Any final questions?
Awesome. So with that, virtual round of applause for Benji. Thank you so much for walking us through Headless WordPress with Vue and Nuxt.
Thank you. Yeah.